what we'd like to do is, see, what specific questions came to your mind as you were going through the presentation and how it relates to your business. Are there particular struggles that you're faced with? The golden sample.
I have a question.
Sure.
Often when you're manufacturing, metal parts, you end up with a homogeneous differential, that it won't mix thoroughly. And so when you're testing something, and also, even plating, when you have crevices, the plate will accumulate differently from a high polished area to a lesser. So how do you determine in this process that you're getting the accurate read? Because what is the surface area that your machine would actually test to?
So Ken, perhaps, the equipment that we're discussing today?
Well, it depends on the spot area that you're using to measure. So each piece of equipment, such as yours, has 4 different types of collimators. So it's collimated to the size of the beam that's being measured. So there's a measurement area that's actually being analyzed. So you can actually collimate how large or small of an area that you want to measure. That comes into play in a lot of people where they're trying to measure, little areas of jewelry that may have a high point or a drag point, or wear point on the bottom of a watch band or something like that they're looking to plate more or less. In crevices where they're just trying to fill it so that it's polished out, you can maneuver the actual part inside the X-ray and measure into those areas.
So would it then average that surface area that you're...
Well, in some cases, for parts that are, say, barrel plated, you can use a larger collimator to average the area, so that if you've got all kinds of dips and valleys, it'll give you an average measurement for that. If it's an actual area that you're concerned about, you can actually make it smaller so you can see if there's actually the lack of plating there.
So you have to X-ray it. My standard is 3 to 5 areas without a single piece. Because even on the rack itself, all right, the middle is the less deposited of the materials when it's plated. So everything on the outside will get deposited more than the one in the middle. So when you take your samples out for the machine to be done, I always want them in the middle because that's the less. And I want to make sure that even the less, the middle pieces that get deposited, the less is still at my mean, my average. All right, we set standards 3 to 5 mils of gold, all right, and we have 5 readings on the same piece to give us the thickness of the gold, and you take the average of that.
Good, thank you.
So if you do it in the middle, then everything else on the outside will have more deposit, more thicker gold.
So any other companies sourcing jewelry products that do in fact contain gold? Are they fashion jewelry?
Fashion.
Strictly fashion jewelry?
Yeah, well, we're not strictly fashion jewelry anymore. We are doing some brands which are now containing 3 to 5 mils of gold. It's a small percentage of our business, but nonetheless.
And historically, have you found it challenging to be able to determine that, the contractual obligations that you have with the vendor to provide you with that exact specification? It's been difficult to determine, in fact, that that's what you're getting?
It's always a question as to whether or not the reading is representative of the parts that have just been produced.
Sure. So what our agenda will consist of today is the presentation portion is complete. We're going to proceed downstairs where we'll be able to actually see the equipment and view some testing in progress. And I encourage you to keep an open dialogue as to thinking about how this would directly relate to your business and the benefits that you can see, and share them with us, because one of the most effective ways that we've been able to continue to develop and secure state-of-the-art equipment is basically an open dialogue with our customer base based upon their needs and based upon what type of technology is available, as well as a lot of the associations that are available that are tirelessly working on your behalf.
Yeah, Brent showed us no relationship between total cadmium and cadmium release, but EU 71, new EU 71 requires, in the case of nickel release. And if the jewelry doesn't contain any nickel, maybe by measuring zero or nickel in that product might prove that we don't have to do the nickel release testing. But because EN71 specifically require nickel release for 1 week period, you're supposed to take 1 square centimeters of the product into the simulated sweat solution and dip it there for a week, and then you're supposed to measure it to come up with whether that product comply with the EN71 or not. How Oxford 980 can be used for that type of situation?
I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know, what is the charge in having to be able to measure it now after you've sweated the material to see if it's actually
It's
there?
actually whether it's released into the sweat, simulate the sweat solution 1 week after you dip it in there.
Wait, and how's the solution measured after that?
No,
Well, then it goes into
Yeah.
a machine to actually come out with the nickel readings.
And what do we normally see for a ppm if it is?
It doesn't usually come out in ppms, it usually comes out in
grams.
Micrograms.
stuff like that. It's 2 for post and 5 for any substrates. See, the process that they use for the EN is basically, and even before that step, you know, they actually, if you get any coatings on it, they throw it into what they call 12472, which is a tumbling machine where they actually take off any coatings or any clear coatings, or even some of the plating comes off at the same time. They actually tub it for, I think it's 4 to 6 hours. Then they take it and then they do the sweat machine. All right, well, the process of putting it in, letting it sit there, and then taking that solution and evaluating that to get your soluble report.
So the question is, how can we,
how the Oxford 980 can be used for that type of release question.
Well, he's looking for, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's looking for a relationship where this machine can actually read, all right, a data point and say, listen, your detectable limit or the data point that you come up with, all right, if you 0.0001, all right, if you come up with that data point, how much of that will leach out, and whether or not, if it does 100% of that leach out of the nickel, all right, based on that EN testing, would relate to their standards that they're setting in the EU.
I don't know if there's anything that you can relate from a one-to-one basis until you've actually tested it. I think that's something that we have
But
to
see,
So typically the
but I
process-
think, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I think that even if you x-ray down 5 levels or 15 levels or whatever you find, and you find non-detected points, all right, or detected points, that the plating plays a major role in how much is actually gonna be sweating out, or how much
That's the
is gonna be
biggest-
leaching out.
Sure.
I talked to Jim and stuff like that, and by the way, executive vice president, executive director, and he's the president, and I'm the vice president of the association. All right? And that's why, I almost fell asleep there in Princeton. No, I'm only kidding, I'm only kidding. But I was telling Jim, all right, that if you go to tanneries, all right, tannery for example, all right, and you plate, normally it's 200 mils of cyanide acid, then 400 mils of acid, heavy acid plating copper, all right, heavy copper is what they call it. Then you put your nickel substitution, whatever it may be, and in his case it's palladium, he put 7 mils of that. Then you put your color on top, and sometimes you even put E-coat on top of that. All right, now your machine's gonna read all the way down, all those levels, all right? Even when it gets down to the substrate, all right, after they do the 12472, which is a tumbling, that's all gonna wear off, because I'll be honest with you, the way Michael plates and the way China plates are completely different. It's like night and day, all right?
I'm well aware of that.
So the imitation rhodium that they use for the nickel substitution, all right, might be loaded with nickel, all right? And then because they put the clear coating on it and stuff like that, you're gonna come out with a high level of nickel. But if you put more and more thicker plating on top of it, or make that imitation rhodium thicker and get rid of some of that nickel that's in there, because you can always adjust your bath, all right? You can come out with non-detectable, all right? And the point is, can a data point give you amount of release in nickel based on the EM testing?
And I'm so glad that you brought up the question, because really there are two things at play here. One is that we're looking to find a ppm relationship with what would then be migratable. So that if we found that, you know, at 5 ppm, it never migrated, then we would be able to adopt the standard to say that if you had a total content of less than 0.05 or 0.5 ppm, then you would then be considered compliant.
The only thing we'd have a problem is just finding out that detectable limit, where it's coming from. Is it coming from the substrate or from the coating?
Well, that's
Yeah.
exactly.
And so that would be very hard to determine until you've actually done 2 tests, one before
Right.
with XRF,
Yeah.
and then you've tumbled it off,
Right.
and you're able to determine if
We'll
it's
go
coming
through
from
the process, the end process, yes.
Right.
And of course, when we go through this testing, we should have then analyzable results.
Now, there is a way too that you can also look and verify if there's a coating spec, that you can actually determine that if it's going to be coated in a particular thickness, what is the absorption rate of the nickel being measured with our XRF into those coating thicknesses that are plating above it.
Good point.
But because there is going to be some absorption rate where the nickel will slowly be hampered. You're not going to see it. But for the kind of jewelry that we're looking at right now, we're not looking at very thick coatings to be able to see that nickel. So it's going to flare up if it's there, especially with the 980.
And the second part to that is that the standard should be changed, that if you went through and did this XRF testing and did not recognize that nickel was there, didn't find any, then you should then be considered compliant. You shouldn't have to do the exposure test. We're actually reconvening the ASTM Children's Committee this fall to deal with this nickel issue. So I encourage you to get involved. I know that you were a member of that committee, and I thank you for all the work that you did.
Yeah.
Well, the only one that's established globally, all right, as a nickel safe, not nickel free, is the European standard, the testing method. No one else has one, all right? In the States, it's not even regulated.
And let's not forget the evolution as to, once the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008 was passed, you know, when XRF technology was becoming more and more popular in the industry, it was still an initial screening process, you know, prior to making the determination as to whether or not they had to proceed still with wet chemistry. So we're on the cutting edge of, you know, having technology that's able to offer a quantitative and qualitative scan, and then of course it may be necessary, of course, at the second phase to proceed with other types of leaching testing for nickel and wet chemistry. So it is very early on in the process. You know, we'd be very anxious to hear some feedback from the CPSC as to, you know, how this will be implemented as more and more nickel regulations are passed in the country.
One thing to also note is that the adult standard does deal with the presence of nickel in one regard. If you say that your jewelry is nickel free, it must be nickel free.
Right.
You know, and so we.
Yeah, no one though uses the term nickel-free any longer.
And if they do, they're up for
Litigation
In
trouble.
which they have been found by the DTSC in California.
Yes.
Now, that just means that it's not published, because every time I walk into a factory, that's all they use for terminology is, no,
But-
that's nickel-free.
But at retail, it's hypoallergenic.
Right, okay.
Which is different.
Right, so for
not
publishing
defined,
and for.
which is not defined as any.
Correct.
Now, why is that? If that's published that way, there are so many people allergic to nickel now, where that's their first concern when they're actually looking. That's just
But
hypoallergenic is
hypoallergenic-
nice, but
Yeah, but
Leachable
the
level of
defined,
nickel
defined
in
as
a
hypoallergenic
hypoallergenic
is
condition.
due diligence,
Mm.
all right? If you've proven, if you've got your records that show, all right, that there's, even the scanning, if you've shown that there's trace amounts that are below, all right, then you can define that as hypoallergenic. Not nickel-free, because there's no such thing, all right, nickel-safe.
Yeah.
Nickel-safe doesn't draw in a customer base, all right, because
Right,
what does that
because it
really
still
mean?
precludes the presence of nickel.
Exactly. So hypoallergenic is the word.
now in the standard that you're writing or looking to do, you definitely don't want to be too open to XRF. In the military specs right now, one of the things that they're looking for is making sure that things have lead and things don't have lead. If they don't have lead, then there's going to be tin whiskering, and we have things that are falling out of the skies. So the military has instituted in certain applications that it's not just XRF measurement, that it's XRF with pin diode detection. So that you actually have a spec that is required by those who are plating to making sure that they're inspecting this with a pin diode detection system. That's what's here. Because XRF measurement from the old days is just a proportional counter, and it's just, you know, is it there? It is. But with, at least with pin diode detection, we're able to get the discernible amount of what it's measuring. So I think we need to at least making sure you draw a distinction with that when you go forward with any kind of legislation or however you want to do that.
And from the scientific perspective, then, you know, if we're able to draw a correlation between, you know, content and leaching, you know, that would be, I'm sure, an initiative that would be raised.
Yes.
And it helps me because I have an entire base out there that has the old XRF, and then when they say, well, we have to meet this standard now, I was like, you can't meet it with that. You gotta buy this.
Can I ask a little different question from the association? United States government is negotiating with the EU countries about the free trade.
Correct.
And they think maybe within 2 years they will agree on a free trade. And one of the major factors is trade barriers according to the technical spec, which means somehow EU and United States has to agree on what kind of regulations both countries is gonna take.
Yes.
And European countries, as you know, this thick regulation on almost anything and almost everything. How the United States jewelry industry will take that kind of regulation if that's applied to the product that's selling in the United States? That's
Well,
not the state level thing anymore. It's gonna be a federal level,
Yes.
which imply that all U.S. continent should comply with that regulation.
Well, of course, we have always recognized that the easiest way that we could accomplish that would be to have our standard attached to CIPSIA, which would be much easier than going through and establishing a whole new federal bill and getting it passed through Congress. But that has very much been on our mind. In fact, when I was over in Vienna, again, the two big topics that were discussed were harmonization of standards and the tariffs. And of course, the Obama administration is dealing with the tariffs, and it's up to us to deal with the harmonization interest. So my recommendation would be for you to call your friends and have them send in really big checks, because if we had the money, we could start that initiative now. I was begged by people that were involved in the EU to please start submitting testimony to the EU, because their numbers are just based on random numbers. It's not based on any scientific risk exposure. You know, they're just picking 500 ppm for cadmium, 100 ppm for lead, or whatever it is. And so it's a problem.
And they're changing it all the time.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because any of the analytical equipment that's able to measure it 3 years ago can't do it anymore because they brought all the data that keeps coming out. So now it's more of a screening process of just trying to get it yay or nay, and then it goes into this pile and it goes into the next screening process.
Right.
And
Instead, you guys have a research to say how harmful for nickel to the human being.
How harmful is nickel to humans?
Yeah.
It's an allergen, so there are some who have an allergic
Just
reaction.
allergy.
Right.
Yeah, Tudor is right.
Right.
Mhm.
And
I
but
know.
realize too, you know, this is an example I like to use often. I've been in manufacturing jewelry for now 42 years. Back in the old days, I remember when pierced earrings were just becoming acceptable and popular, to the point where literally anything we made and put a post on sold. You know, it was merely, especially in Rhode Island, which was the jewelry capital of the world, that was the hub for all of the distribution. In those days, there were no regulations, and people were using anything for posts until women started to get, you know, an allergic reaction and an infection from wearing a badly plated, literally brass post. So the industry then acted, and we devised the surgical steel post, which had fusion heads on it, to where we were able to you know, fuse these metal posts onto findings and that kind of thing. or use a silver or gold. And so the standard was, it was hypoallergenic, or gold-filled, or silver or gold. Those were the only options. You couldn't buy the bad posts anymore. And that's when we started with the hypoallergenic descriptive. So that's an example of how the industry then responded to a problem, effectuated a positive change without the need for legislation and standards.
So would that have been a time when there may have been some confusion as to whether or not somebody was actually just getting an infection or whether they were actually having an allergic reaction to nickel as well?
Well, in the earlobe, when you're piercing mucous membrane, they call it, that irritant can become an infection.
I heard over the radio saying that Berkshire Foundation, the wise man of Omaha, he's coming to Massachusetts jewelry industry on a condition that Mass government allow them something like a $90 million tax credit on a promise that they will increase the employment by 100 people in certain jewelry factory. Do you know anything?
I know a great deal about that. It's under his division. Berkshire Hathaway has a Richline group, which has gone out and made 42 acquisitions. I believe that's the right number.
It's been
It's,
several, I don't know the total.
And they have been consolidating all of those operations in their Pearl Street headquarters, which is in Attleboro. And so they're utilizing whatever tax advantages they can negotiate. But those jobs are on their way. Either they have been moved to Attleboro or they're on their way. But
All of them are
is-
jewelry industry?
Yes, in fact, it was Cookson, which owned Stern Leach, and Stern Metals Group was the main company that was on that Pearl Street address. Then they bought Excel Chain, and that moved in, and then they bought Findings Companies and moved them in, and they're just consolidating all of their operations. They also bought a company that I used to run called Dolith, and that was bought by Primetime, which got bought by Berkshire Hathaway, and that has then been moved. So there has been a consolidation, if you will.
Are they gonna do the manufacturing here, or it's just
Well, that facility is a full metals fabrication factory.
There's a growing undercurrent for jewelry made in the US again, which they may be trying to seize an opportunity on by establishing a full-fledged manufacturing facility should a made in the US market grow.
So Jim, do you think that's a reaction to the popularity of the Alex and Alani line, which markets made in America?
It could possibly be. When I first heard about Berkshire Hathaway expressing interest, it was specifically in sterling silver products, but it sounds like it's expanding itself.
And that, of course, raises another very interesting question. What is made in USA? Because, of course, for decades, spring rings have always been imported. Gold came from Italy, the others came from, base metal would be from Korea or China. And so if you use that on manipulation of an American product, does that then make that item not made in USA? So the FTC is currently involved in a description of what is made in USA and what percentage of that product can be made with component parts that are not from the USA, if any.
Well, the standard rule back then was, one, if it's manipulated and assembled in the final stage in the USA, and 75% of the components are made in the USA, then you can put that in there. Now, if things change since then, I'm not aware of that.
I think the 75% has been dropped closer to 50.
Well, like I said, I haven't seen anything.
Yeah.
And they're working on that whole revision.
It's the completed product and component, there's a ratio, so.
So
Okay,
it's not
so-
definition what you can label as made in USA right now, they're working on this.
Right now, they're
Well,
working
there
on
is
revision.
a definition today,
Today,
which
yeah.
is in place and must be followed, but it sounds like they are reviewing to see if that might change.